So I attended the Toronto International Film Festival and it was pretty neat. I didn't see as many movies as I expected, but I got through pretty much all the main ones I was aiming for, so I'm going to share most of those with you today. I won't be talking about every movie I saw in detail because I saw about 40, so I'll just kind of be glossing over some. Maybe I'll make like a separate like Patreon video or something going into those ones more in detail, but I did talk about everything I saw over on the Intercut podcast, so if you want to go check that out. And there's also a handful of movies that I had already seen at the Cannes Film Festival that I won't be talking about because I've already talked about them in that video, like Triangle of Sadness, Decision to Leave, Broker, which were all some of my favorite movies of the year so far. So if you want to hear my thoughts on those, go back and check that video that I'll have linked down below. So I'm gonna run through these in a little bit of like a weird order. I'm gonna start with the worst that I saw. I know I usually like to hold those off to the end, but I figured we'd get right into the spiciness here today, then take a little detour to like the weirdest movie I saw, then lightly touch on some of the ones that I watched but they didn't quite hit, so I won't go into too much detail before running through, into my like honorable mentions and then into my favorites. Again, if you want like more clarification on anything that I saw, feel free to ask, but I will try to like flash my star rating on screen, even though those tend to change for me a lot. But first, a message from today's sponsor, Ridge Wallets. I don't know if you can tell this about me, but I'm not exactly a purse person, so having a compact RFID blocking wallet is essential to me, and Ridge is that wallet. They hold up to 12 cards easily accessible with a quick push and come with either a cash strap or a money clip to hold your bills. They also have daily driver kits that come with wallets and a matching key case to keep your keys organized and easily accessible. So if you want to try out Ridge for yourself or as a gift this holiday season, make sure to click the link in the description down below and use code JEDI to save 10%. Alright, so before we dive into the worst of the movies I saw, I figured I'd take a quick second to talk about what actually ended up being like the most anticipated thing at TIFF in conversation with Taylor Swift. I still don't know how I got a ticket to this. I just checked like the morning before and there was press tickets available, so I got it. So this confused a lot of people. Why was Taylor Swift doing something at a film festival? But she was actually invited to show the 35mm print version of her short film music video that accompanied her version of All Too Well. Then after screening it, do a general conversation with TIFF CEO Cameron Bailey about her creative process and what went into making it. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that 35mm print was gorgeous, and I am very happy I was able to catch it. And she really went into detail about how she learned about the different types of film stock, which ones would work better for her different needs, like the interior shots, the exterior, warm and cold. How the whole thing probably wouldn't have happened if Sadie Sink hadn't agreed to play the lead, but why wouldn't Sadie Sink have agreed to that? Overall, it was really good and very interesting. It was super great hearing her talk. Oh, also, there was this other dude in a cowboy hat and a massive backpack who was clearly trying to get Taylor Swift to sign his drum head, but he cut through the line, lied about having a ticket, and then like ducked off to the side when it was time to scan tickets because I think he thought he was going to be able to catch her walking in, as if they were going to bring Taylor Swift through the main entrance. But let's hop into the movies. So for the worst movies I saw, these ones might be a shock. This year we did not have a Dear Evan Hansen. There's nothing that was so bad in a way that was fun to talk about, but there are some that certainly impassioned me, and I'm being honest when some of the worst movies I saw this festival were from major directors with major studio backing. And the first one is Florian Zeller's The Son, as in the director of the Academy Award nominated Best Picture The Father. Now there are a lot of things wrong with The Son, starting with Florian Zeller's introduction to the movie, claiming that he was concerned with the epidemic of teenage depression and wanted to make a movie about it. Except he did not accomplish that. It honestly doesn't seem like he tried to do that at all. This is a movie about a father dealing with an individual with adolescent depression, which could have worked and been super meaningful. It's like a pretty common thing that parents don't always know how to react to their kids if they're depressed or dealing with mental health issues, especially if the kid isn't able to verbalize what's wrong or how they're feeling. It can lead to parents getting mad because they're confused. They may try to punish behaviors that actually need assistance. And we do see some of that here, but holy shit, just terrible execution. It just gives me the impression that Zellers never talked to a teenager with depression, or as my friend said, perhaps anyone with depression. And it just really keeps getting worse from there. Honestly, the more I think about this movie, the less I like it. A big area where I think this lost out is that for so much of the runtime, the kid's saying, I don't know why I'm sad. I don't really want to be alive anymore, which is valid, but then the whole movie just pins it on him not being able to handle his parents' divorce from 2 years ago. And I'm not saying that isn't a reason why a kid might be in distress. It's just the entire picture forming around that doesn't work. And sadly, one of the major issues is that the kid himself can't act that well. And the script did absolutely nothing to help that, because even Jackman struggles with some of the line delivery. The acting doesn't come across like a kid who's sincerely trying to express his pain, but more like a kid who's addicted to drugs, trying to get money out of his parents with what he currently believes to be genuine emotions. And when a character who the audience needs to feel empathy for comes across as unlikable and manipulative, that is just a fatal flaw for the film. It's not the worst movie I've seen in my life. There are some real strong performances out of Jackman and Dern, and particularly Vanessa Kirby, but it's all just undercut by this horrible writing and a lack of understanding of what's being brought to screen. It also lacks any kind of interesting filmmaking like we saw with The Father, because that was taking place from the perspective of someone dealing with Alzheimer's. Yeah, this one just really didn't do it for me. Empire of Light is the latest from Sam Mendes, largely telling the story of Hillary, a cinema employee, and her budding relationship with a new employee, Steven, which felt weird because she is technically his boss, and it is a very messy movie. There are like 3 to 4 stories telling dominance here, and it weakens them all as a result. Other than a couple of scenes that were shot in the cinema where like a large chunk of the story is set that feels like they were just put in because Sam Mendes wanted the movie to tie back to cinema, this whole thing could have happened in a hotel and been exactly the same. This is a movie that is beautifully shot, has great performances, and all these individual filmmaking elements come together, but the screenplay is so weak that it makes it really hard to like and very easy to trash when you know it had so many resources behind it. We got Deakins behind the camera. This movie is taking big swings at some very important issues like violent racism and serious mental illness, but serves them up in a way that's overlong and entirely unfocused, which is unfair to them. Also, Colin Firth has just been entirely too horny this year, and we need to chill out on that with him. So those are my hot, not so hot takes for the worst. I don't think those have been getting a ton of love coming out of the festival season, but yeah, so let's just move on to the special little spot for this year's weirdest movie I saw. It is certainly not up there with something like Mother Schmuckers, but it is BIOSPHERE, one of the final additions to the festival, which tells the story of the presumed last 2 men on Earth and their push for survival, and then it goes in a really weird direction. I can't even specify what direction that is because it'll absolutely pull away from the impact from experiencing it in the movie. I feel like as it's going, you will see where the story is going. There's like a moment where you're like, oh no. And I think if it had been handled better, I would have liked it more, but there's some issues with that writing that don't quite sit well with me. That it just left me feeling weird, but it is very funny. I think it's very strong on the top end, and for me, it just loses a lot of steam as it moves into its conclusion, but I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy it. Now, just to quickly run through some of the ones that fell short for me, we got Butcher's Crossing with Nick Cage, The Wonder with Florence Pugh, Happiest Man in the World, The Origin of Evil, which with better editing and probably a tighter script might have been one of my favorites of the festival, A Man of Reason, which felt like a watered down John Wick that used Gautier, somebody that I used to know, way too liberally. Like if I was playing a drinking game, I might be dead. Raymond and Ray had its buddy moments with Ewan McGregor and Ethan Hawke, but it wasn't anything particularly special. Roost, which felt like an Am I the Asshole Reddit post turned into a movie, but like not necessarily in a fun way. The more I tried to talk about Roost, the more I feel like it would make people want to watch it, but it was just kind of largely forgettable. Project Wolf Hunting was just way too much for the 8:30 a.m. I saw it at. It is exceedingly violent. There's so much fake blood. It should have been right up my alley, but there was just like a major element to the story that I didn't like, and it's too long. Baby Ruby is a story about postpartum depression that committed to that assignment so hard with a crying baby that I almost had to leave the theater. It is not a bad movie. It was just very hard for me to watch. The Inspection is a military movie based on the director's real life, but felt like it had very mixed politics on the US Marines, and the final takeaway for me about the Brotherhood seemed to be more like, ma'am, only we, the Marines, can be homophobic to him. Ooh rah. Causeway was a nice little movie and a return to a more simple Jennifer Lawrence performance. In a good way, Brian Tyree Henry was also fantastic, but ultimately it feels like it didn't flesh out its ideas enough. Manticore is one that was like kind of really hard to place. It's a very slow burn about a successful video game designer with a dark secret. It brings up some interesting questions about the ethics of digital art in regards to actual crime. It's a very challenging watch and ends in a way I never would have expected, but it just takes too long to get there, which is unfortunate because I feel like it could have done so much more with that third act if it had been stretched out more than the first act. So now we'll talk about some of the more anticipated movies that didn't make it onto my top list, that I didn't love but also didn't hate, starting with Pearl. I think this just felt too much like an extended short film. I'm really just not huge on the character of Pearl. It felt like it was way too drawn out, but it's something that started as a character examination for Mia Goth to better understand the character of Pearl. I think that's a great thing that A24 gave them the green light to film. The Midnight Madness crowd was great for it though. I think I had a better time with the reaction to the Bulgari ad than the movie itself. And getting that Maxine trailer at the end was amazing. That one I'm actually excited for because I do like her character. My Policeman, obviously highly anticipated due to Harry Styles. I think the Letterboxd score speaks for itself because I assume a large number of those 5 stars are people who haven't seen the movie yet or people who have that we're gonna give it 5 stars no matter what. It tells a story about how 3 people's lives become intertwined as a man tries to conceal his homosexuality from the world by marrying a woman. Till as old as time. I'm sorry. And it was fine. It has aspects that work, aspects that really don't. And my meme takeaway was calling it My Policeman's Notebook because it does the Notebook thing where we're kind of cutting back from the characters in their older age to when they were younger and how it built into where they got. I found that the first 15 minutes in particular were kind of rough, but it does eventually find its footing. However, I feel like the characters in the movie really gloss over how shitty Harry Styles' character has been to everyone. Like, he kind of gets called out on his shit at the last second, but at that point, it's been like 50 plus years. Though each character makes mistakes, some of which are unforgivable, Harry's character is an ass. But he does seem to be better at acting emotionally vulnerable with a loved person than he is at being angry with a loved person, which was nice to see. I do think he was better in this movie than he was in Don't Worry, Darling, outside a couple of reactions. I also felt way more invested in the cast with their younger lives and their older selves, and the movie just kind of felt stifled with having to shift back and forth. It was honestly more depressing than if it had just ended with them being miserable in their 20s. I think maybe it could have started with them older and ended with them older, but I guess it doesn't necessarily work with the premise that this is supposed to be her kind of like having her own recollections and like reading someone's journals. The Good Nurse tells the story of the real life nurse who was murdering patients by tampering with medical supplies and the nurse that helped bring him to justice. Chastain's performance in this was really strong, but I just found that like the procedural side of hospital bureaucracy behaving like the Catholic Church and just like bopping him around at different locations was way more interesting than what we got, and I felt like it just kind of dragged on. I do think it's a very interesting and harrowing story. I just almost wish we had spent more time with the investigation than with her. The greatest beer run ever.
My next door neighbor, he brought me a beer. Hey.
Zaffron is back, baby, and this time it's as an ill-advised buddy on his way to Vietnam to give his pals some beers during the war who learns, wow, war is actually bad. Maybe the American people are being lied to about Vietnam. Maybe our boys aren't protecting our rights. Oh no! A war crime? Well, at least I come across as endearing to the local characters. This one is currently available on Apple Plus, so you can watch it right now. You know, in some ways, it's charming how easily he traipsed across the war zone, knowing that it's based on a true story, but it's just the lack of nuance is fairly notable, and it takes a little bit too long for someone to just be like,
you think this is funny?
You got a good heart, chickie. It's your brains I'm worried about.
But this is definitely a general people pleaser movie. I think a lot of people are really gonna like it, and it is an excellent advertisement for Pabst Blue Ribbon. Like, they have to be a sponsor, right? All right, so that is gonna bring us into kind of our runner-ups and the ones to like maybe keep in mind, we got Susie Searches, which feels like the perfect Netflix or just general streaming movie. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's a nice little layered mystery about a girl who's desperately trying to build up her true crime podcast who finds herself at the center of the disappearance of a fellow student. I think it loses a little bit of steam in different areas. A lot of the humor didn't quite hit with me, but it does feature Rachel Sennett, and she always adds to every movie that she is in. But it is cute and fun and definitely goes in a direction I wasn't originally expecting. It gets quite dark. It's perfect for streaming. No Bears is a movie that starts in a way that seems like fairly basic. You got a man who's directing a movie through video chats about a couple who seem to be seeking to escape the country, while another forbidden love story is taking shape where he's currently living. It starts in a way that's quite comedic when he takes a picture of something that he doesn't even realize is a problem, but eventually starts to bloom in exceedingly complex ways around the politics, religion, and social customs. And by the end, it is absolutely brutal. It might not be the movie for everyone, but I do definitely think it's worth watching. The director tragically is currently in jail simply for the crime of protesting and making films that go against the ideal image the Iranian government would like expressed to the world. So for that alone, his work is worth checking out and supporting. How to Blow Up a Pipeline was a pretty interesting movie, kind of built out around the nonfiction book of the same title, and it's super well told. It follows a group of young environmental activists who escalate to planning and carrying out the bombing of a pipeline in Texas. The story's told in a pretty interesting non-linear way where it kind of picks up right with the action, but then as it's progressing, we'll kind of jump back to different character backgrounds into how they got involved in this and what their personal motivations are. It's tense, it stays interesting, and while it is overly simplistic at times with like the planning and how everything's shaked out in the execution, it's definitely an entertaining watch. Alice Darling was a very effective movie about being an emotionally and psychologically abusive relationship, where someone specifically doesn't have to be violent with you to have total control over your life and headspace. It goes through all the little ways that partners can try to isolate you from friends and family, the ways they'll make you feel guilty for wanting to hang out with other people, how it can make you lash out at the people you care about because you just don't want to deal with your partner's reaction. Anna Kendrick absolutely knocked the performance out of the park. The little things she does when she's stressed, like the hair twirling and pulling, the constant monitoring of her phone, but the anxiety every time it goes off, definite recommend. Another one that you can watch right now in theaters, and maybe should, apparently it's underperforming, is Bros. While it is a little bit overlong, it is very funny, very entertainment. It doesn't feel like there's like a second that goes by where Eichner isn't tossing out some kind of quip in a good way. Weird is the parody biopic about the parody song maker himself, Weird Al Yankovic. I may end up making a dedicated video about this movie because it was really fun. I caught it at the Midnight Madness screening, which was the world premiere, and super great. There was such good energy in the crowd I felt amongst my people with the floral shirts everywhere. And honestly, this movie starts so incredibly strong. I think the more it spirals into being super absurd, it gets a little bit less effective, but it's still absolutely worth the watch, especially where it's just going to be streaming on the Roku channel, I think in November. And it definitely still has jokes in the latter half that hit. Like there's this whole thing about like beat it and eat it, had me dying. And yeah, Daniel Radcliffe did great. He pulled it off. This is exactly the kind of work he should be doing. I also realized that between the shirts and the checkered Vans, I basically dress exactly like Weird Al. And lastly for the section is one I've kind of been like bouncing around back and forth as to whether or not it's like one of my favorites or kind of like almost there, but The Fabelmans, which is the deeply personal semi-autobiographical movie by Steven Spielberg, directed by Steven Spielberg. And while a lot of it is about the love of filmmaking and how he built his passion for filmmaking, specifically how at times in his life he may have used it as a way to gain more control, Spielberg's been quite open about the ways his perception of his parents' divorce shaped his filmmaking, and this movie examines that through the lens of Sammy Fabelman and his coming-of-age story of realizing a secret in his family. There's some really nice moments that show this like genuine love for film and learning the craft of filmmaking, while also being an emotional examination of his life and how different things played into where he got. But at the same time, some of the delivery felt a little bit fake, almost as if you're looking back at it through like a snow globe that's making everything look super idealized, even in the moments where, you know, bad things are happening. And I do feel like it ended when it really just could have started. It felt like he had so much to say at different points of his life, to the point that I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if We got a sequel that was just called Fabelmans. Because it'll only be about Sammy. So let's jump into my favorites of the festival, starting with the menu, which I will be making a full video, either when it's out in theaters or definitely by the time it's out on VOD. So I won't say too much more other than I really enjoyed it. I wish we had gotten a little bit more in certain areas. It definitely goes from like 0 to 100 very quickly and then stays at that 100 point for the remainder of the movie, but it was a blast to watch, and Anya Taylor-Joy and Ralph Fiennes play off each other perfectly.
Are you crying?
It's just I find it all very moving.
Women Talking is probably the most accurately titled movie of the festival. It follows a group of women debating what they should do following the realization that they'd all been assaulted by men in their isolated religious colony, who then tried to blame it on ghosts and demons and the devil until they were finally caught. It's a harrowing story of women trying to process their pain, trauma, and emotions while reckoning with religious laws about forgiveness and eternal damnation. And while the perpetrators have been arrested, the remaining men have gone to post their bail, so they have a very limited time to make their decision. I absolutely recommend catching it. Sarah Polley did an absolutely amazing job directing these incredibly talented women in these very difficult dialogues and conversations, so it's up there. Sometimes a movie is weakened by reading the premise, but with Aftersun, I might actually recommend it. The movie is essentially about a woman named Sophie reflecting on a holiday she took with her dad 20 years earlier by watching through the recordings they made together on the trip. But watching it, that might not immediately be obvious, which is fine because there is a point where does become obvious. At first, it just seems like a movie about a father and daughter on vacation, and they're occasionally documenting aspects of the trip. But the pieces start to swirl together out of the opening scene where a father seems haunted by being asked the simple question of what he wanted to be when he was 11. It's essentially this woman looking back at a time in her life, trying to find a missing piece of information about her father, a piece she wouldn't have been able to see or understand as a child. It's hauntingly beautiful, probably Paul Mescal's best role, and the girl Frankie Corio is absolutely incredible, and it's her first acting role. This is a movie that's as tender and sweet as it is brutal, and I absolutely recommend it. I Like Movies is one of the more simple movies on this list, but that doesn't make it any less effective.
You guys finding everything okay today?
Do you work here?
No.
For all the movies at this festival that claim to be about the love of cinema, this one feels to be the most authentic and relatable. As someone who worked in a store that sold movies for like 10 years all through high school and university, a lot of this movie hits. The protagonist might not be the most likable character, but that's kind of the point, and it works. It feels honest. I also feel like this movie deals with an inappropriate age gap relationship in a much better way than recent outings. I also see a lot of people calling it Lady Bird for film kids, and yes, that is absolutely accurate. I feel like you can get that vibe from the trailer alone, which is kind of like a teaser clip. And it's Canadian! Let's go Canada!
It's not a contest. Our lives are equally hard.
The Whale, adapted for film by Darren Aronofsky and written by the playwright himself, Samuel D. Hunter. The Whale is probably one of the most hyped and anticipated movies coming out of the fall festival circuit that's already primed for conversation from those who have and haven't seen it alike. It tells the story of Charlie, an online English teacher dealing with obesity and attempting to reconnect with his estranged daughter. And the core of the story is really that attempt to reconnect, to find a way to reach his daughter. But the burden of regret and the loss he's experienced has led him to binge eating. And I know that's a topic that a lot of people don't want explored on screen, at least not in the way that they're getting the perception of this movie. I know people are very sick of the fat suits, and I get all those arguments. There's definitely moments where Aronofsky uses sound design to enhance certain feelings in the audience that might seem over the top to show the damage Charlie's doing to himself, but that sound design is just as often used in really strong and emotionally evocative ways. And that side of the story comes from a personal experience of the writer. In our Q&A, he talked about self-medicating with food due to years of religious trauma and people telling him he'd be going to hell for being gay, so that's an aspect of his life that he brought to this story. I don't think this is gonna hit with everyone. A lot of people are gonna hate it for a variety of reasons, but there are some deeply emotional, resounding moments. Like, I really didn't think I was gonna cry as much as I did. And some of the lines and moments are just burned into my brain, and I think the emotion and passion behind the project really overpowers a lot of the shortcomings. We're shown a lot of nuance nuance about this man's life. The ways he's good and the ways he's been cruel. Brendan Fraser did such an incredible job bringing this character to life and all of the complex ways that he exists as a person. And while it's not my favorite Sadie Sink performance, she really brought it where it counted. But on top of Fraser, the real show stealer here that probably isn't gonna get enough attention is Hong Chau as Liz. She knocked it out of the park. Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery, aka Knives Out 2, was one of my most anticipated films of the festival, and it did not let me down, and I was so excited to have caught the world premiere. Now there are some different opinions here, but for me, it did not exceed the original. This one does feel very similar, but bigger. We got a bigger premise, bigger location, it's more grandiose, more on the nose. We get a lot of references that feel very specific to now and might end up dated down the line, but it was still a blast. But as much as I enjoyed it, it just didn't quite hit to the levels of part one, and that might just be because the first one felt so refreshing at the time. Glass Onion wears so much of its mystery on its sleeve, but as Rian Johnson says, that's kind of the point, rewarding viewers for paying attention. And yeah, it's fun watching and noticing things and being like, and then being right about it. Like my notes just had me being like, oh, I saw someone do a thing. Johnson said it's a fool's game to try to outsmart the audience, and that sometimes it's better to take people on a ride versus a chess game, bringing it right back that whole thriller wrapped in a whodunit. And I personally love that. It's fun, funny, it's a blast. It's the perfect theater movie, and it's why I'm actually quite bummed that it's basically going right to Netflix other than a limited theatrical release. Like, that is a genuine tragedy, but I hope you all enjoy it. If you get the chance to catch in theaters, please do. There's also one joke about sweatpants that is like 2 layers, and when it hits the second layer of the joke, oh my god.
I just don't like you no more. You liked me yesterday.
What means more, being kind or being remembered? That's a question the Banshees of Inisherin asks in the heights of its perfectly crafted dramedy. And it's rare for something to balance those two elements of drama and comedy together so flawlessly, but my god, Martin McDonagh nailed it. Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson masterfully bring together this relationship of two pals when one abruptly decides to end the friendship. What starts as light fun and bewilderment out of Farrell quickly flips to some of the most extreme and obsessive behavior you'll likely ever witness in a movie. The more Farrell tries to fix the friendship, the more resolved in his ultimatum Gleeson becomes, an ultimatum that is essentially the equivalent of cutting off your nose to spite your face. While I think Farrell's the standout in the movie, all the performances here are so great, and just especially how they all interact with one another. Between Gleeson and Farrell, Farrell and Keoghan and Condon, all living on this Irish island, seemingly lost in time in their way of living while the Irish Civil War rages on across the way. And what Farrell does with those eyebrows, astounding. And as brutal as it gets at times, it was still dishing out some of the funniest lines I've heard in a movie in ages. The movie made me laugh, it made me cry, at times I felt horrified. It's impressive for a movie to achieve so much range of emotion so flawlessly. It's an absolute recommend out of me, and I would die for Jenny the Donkey.
Everyone to a man knows Mozart's name.
I don't, so there goes that theory.
Which brings us to my favorite of the festival that should not be surprising to anybody who's familiar with this channel, but it's definitely also not one of the popular choices, Sanctuary. My exact Letterboxd review as a pervy little weirdo, perhaps my favorite of TIFF so far, and it stayed there. Sanctuary is a 2-person film starring my indie film festival darling, Christopher Abbott, who you may recognize from movies like Black Bear, On the Count of Three, Possessor, a lot of other ones on the festival circuits, and the show Girls, and fan favorite Margaret Qualley. This is a movie that I will absolutely still be covering separately once it releases because I love it so much. It somehow ends up being a cross-section of so much of what I cover on my channel, from like the good and the bad, but then it puts it together great. It essentially completely takes place in one hotel room between the heir to a hotel empire and his dominatrix. You seeing the pieces of the puzzle as to why this is perfect for my channel? And it kind of cycles through these different stages as the story develops, and my god. It basically just starts with them playing through a very well-crafted dom scenario, but then when it's over, he basically says that their working relationship here has to end. He's about to take over this hotel empire following the death of his father, and he just can't be living this lifestyle anymore. But Rebecca isn't ready for the arrangement to end. So the two start going back and forth with negotiations and mind games as it builds into its fantastic conclusion where she has just been like, basically mentally torturing this man for hours. It's a short watch. I gladly would have watched so much more of it, but I had an absolute blast. The chemistry between these two leads is outstanding, which is just so important when they're literally the entire movie. It's so good. I loved it. That is gonna do it for this rundown of the Toronto International Film Festival. I'm sure this is gonna end up being way longer than I wanted it to be. I'm sorry that I glossed over a bunch, but let me know what you guys are thinking in the comment section down below. Thank you all so much for watching. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters and my YouTube channel members. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, leave a like on the video if you're into that kind of thing. All my social medias are listed down below if you wanna follow me there. I hope you're all having a fantastic day. I'm mostly okay, and we'll catch you all later.